My stepmother sent me a text at 6:47 a.m. on the morning of my father's funeral. Not a call, a text. It said, "The lawyer will be reading the will this afternoon. You don't need to be there. Your father made his wishes very clear." I was standing in the bathroom of the Holiday Inn, 3 blocks from the church, still in my pajamas, mascara from the night before, dried into the creases under my eyes. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the counter and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. My name is Hazel. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed insolvency trustee, which means I spend my working life untangling financial disasters that people created quietly over years, while everyone around them smiled and said nothing. I know what hidden money looks like. I know what paperwork that shouldn't exist looks like. I know what a signature under duress looks like. I knew it because I had seen it before. I just never thought I'd be looking at my own father's name on the bottom of it. My father, Robert, passed away 11 days before that morning. He had a massive stroke in the backyard of the house he'd lived in for 30 years. The house I grew up in, the house my mother died in, the house my mother died in, the house that was supposed to be mine someday. He was 68 years old, and he was alone when it happened, because his wife, my stepmother Sandra, had driven to Kelowna for the weekend to visit her son from her first marriage. Her son, not our family, hers. Sandra had been in my father's life for 6 years. They married 4 years ago, and I will say this once and only once. I tried. I genuinely tried. I brought wine to dinners I wasn't comfortable at. I smiled through Christmas mornings where she rearranged my mother's ornaments on the tree without asking. I sent birthday cards. I answered her calls when she wanted to complain about her son's girlfriend, a woman I had never met, and I listened and I said the right things, because that's what you do when you love your parent and want them to be happy. What I did not do was sign off on the quiet erosion of everything my father had built. Let me back up. My father was an electrician for 31 years. He owned his own business starting when I was 7. He wasn't flashy. He drove a Ford F-150 with 280,000 kilometers on it because it still ran fine. He packed the same lunch every day, a thermos of coffee, a ham sandwich, an apple. He never talked about money at the dinner table because his own father had grown up during hard times and taught him that talking about money was a kind of bragging. But the money existed. He had built something real and quiet and solid. The house in Abbotsford was paid off. There was a cabin in the Okanagan that had been in our family since before I was born. There was a life insurance policy, a registered account, and a non-registered investment account he'd been contributing to since 1994. I knew this not because he told me directly, but because 6 years ago, just before he met Sandra, he had sat me down at the kitchen table with all of his documents spread out and said, "Hazel, I want you to know where everything is, just in case." I was 25. I became his informal estate executor in everything but name. He updated his will that same year. I was the sole beneficiary, the cabin, the house, the accounts, all of it. Then Sandra came along. Sandra is 54 years old. She has a son named, I'm going to call him by what I privately called him for 4 years, her son. I'll call him that because giving him a name makes him feel more real than he deserves to be. He's 33. He has a landscaping business that is filed for creditor protection twice. He drives a truck that I'm fairly certain my father helped pay for. He calls my father Bob and shakes his hand like a business contact. 18 months before my father died, something shifted. The calls between me and my dad got shorter. When I drove out to Abbotsford for Sunday dinners, Sandra would find reasons to be in whatever room we were in. The conversations changed. My father started repeating things she said, using her phrasing, her framing. "Hazel, you know I want things to be fair. You know I think of Sandra's family as my family too. I didn't fight it out loud. I fought it the way I know how. I started keeping records. Every conversation where finances came up, I wrote a date and a note on my phone. Every time my father mentioned a change he was thinking about, I wrote it down. I wasn't planning anything. I just had a professional instinct that something was moving in the background, and I didn't know yet what it was. What I found out later, from the lawyer, was this: Sandra had brought my father to a new estate lawyer 14 months before his death. Not the lawyer he'd used for 30 years. A new one. An office in Langley that neither of us had ever heard of. She drove him there herself. She waited in the lobby. The will he signed that day left a house to her. The non-registered investment account to her son. The cabin, my mother's cabin, the one with the screened-in porch and the canoe my grandfather built, to Sandra, with instruction that it be sold and proceeds split between her and her son. The only thing that remained for me was the life insurance policy, which my father had set up before Sandra and which, fortunately, requires a direct change of beneficiary form that she apparently didn't know about or didn't get to in time. So, the text at 6:47 a.m., the morning of the funeral, "You don't need to be there." I picked my phone back up. I typed, "I'll be there." I put on the black dress I had brought. I went to the church. I sat in the front pew because he was my father, and no text message was going to change that. She sat 2 people away from me and did not look at me once. I want to tell you about something I learned early in my career. In insolvency work, the fraud is almost never complicated. It doesn't look like the movies. It doesn't involve hackers or offshore wire transfers in the middle of the night. It looks like a tired old man who trusts the person sitting next to him. It looks like paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. It looks like someone being in the room when they shouldn't be, and no one noticing. The legal standard for challenging a will in British Columbia involves 2 main arguments. The first is lack of testamentary capacity, meaning the person didn't fully understand what they were signing. The second is undue influence, meaning someone with power over them used that power to change what the document said. My father had a minor stroke 2 years before the major one. It was small enough that Sandra told the family it was just a dizzy spell, and he was totally fine. It was documented at Royal Columbian Hospital. The date was 3 months before he signed the new will. I found the hospital record because I am his emergency contact, and I did not know about that admission until I called the hospital myself 6 weeks after the funeral on a hunch. I'm going to skip the part where I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and cried for 20 minutes. That part is mine. What I will tell you is that I called my lawyer that same afternoon, a woman I had worked with on a creditor dispute 2 years prior, sharp and methodical and not remotely impressed by anyone's theatrics. I told her what I had. She told me we had enough to file a notice of objection to probate. Then I went back to work. Literally. I had a case on my desk, a small construction company in Surrey whose owner had been siphoning receivables into a numbered company for 3 years. I sat down, I opened the file, and I kept going. Because that is the thing about training your brain to follow the money. It doesn't stop. It never stops. And at that point, following something was the only thing keeping me functional. Sandra moved quickly after probate was filed. I expected that. People who have done something they know is wrong tend to move quickly when they realize someone is paying attention. She called my aunt. She called my father's oldest friend, a man who had known our family since before I was born. She told them I was contesting the will out of greed, that my father had loved her and I was trying to undo his final wishes, that I had never accepted their marriage. Some of them called me. I answered. I said, I'm not contesting the will out of greed. I'm contesting it because he had a documented neurological event 3 months before signing it, and she was the only person in the room with him at the attorney's office. I said it once, calmly, and then I stopped explaining myself. Here is something I want to say clearly. I did not hate Sandra for being in my father's life. I did not hate her for being happy with him or him with her. I am 31 years old, and I have sat across the table from people who have done genuinely terrible things with other people's money, and I understand that human beings are capable of real cruelty toward the people who trust them most. What I hated was the cabin, not because of what it was worth, because of what it was. My mother died when I was 16. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. The last summer she was well enough to travel, we spent 2 weeks at that cabin. Just the 3 of us. My parents slept in the back bedroom with the window that looked out over the water. I slept in the loft with the wool blankets that smelled like cedar and lake. My mother taught me to kayak that summer, which she had also learned as an adult, so we were both terrible at it and we didn't care. On the last morning before we drove home, she made coffee and we sat on the screened porch and she said, "Hazel, when things get hard, and they will get hard, come back here. You'll remember who you are." Sandra had listed it with a realtor in October. The listing went live while the estate was still in probate. I found out through a Google alert I had set up on the property address. I want to describe to you what it feels like to see your dead mother's home appear as a featured listing on a real estate website. But I think if you have ever lost someone, you already know. And if you haven't, I don't have the words. What I did instead of feeling it was pull up the listing and screenshot every photo. The porch. The canoe shed. The kitchen with the yellow curtains my mother sewed. I saved them all to a folder on my desktop and I labeled it evidence because that was the only word I could use at that moment that didn't break me. The probate objection hearing was set for January. Sandra's lawyer sent letters. Our lawyer replied, "The process was slow and expensive, and it was exactly as unpleasant as you'd imagine it to be." Her son, who I had seen maybe 9 times in 4 years, suddenly became very visible. He was photographed at family events on Sandra's social media. He posted a tribute to my father on the anniversary of his death that referred to him as my stepdad Bob, and got 47 comments from people who had never met my father in their lives. I did not comment. In November, our lawyer forwarded me a document from the opposing legal team. It was a declaration from the estate attorney who had drafted the new will, the one in Langley. In the declaration, the attorney stated that he had spoken privately with my father before the signing and that my father had demonstrated full understanding of the document. What the declaration did not say, that Sandra had been present at the consultation meeting 2 weeks prior. What it did not say, that my father's GP, who I had also contacted, had noted in his chart that my father showed some short-term memory concerns at an appointment 1 month before the signing. The GP had referred him to a neurologist. That appointment had never happened. It was scheduled for a date that fell 2 weeks after the signing. My lawyer read the GP notes and was very quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she said, "Hazel, I think we have undue influence." The hearing happened on a Tuesday in January. I drove to the courthouse in New Westminster in the dark because it was January in the Lower Mainland and there is no other kind of mourning. I wore the gray suit I wear to complex insolvency hearings. I brought a binder. I brought a second binder. Sandra arrived with her son and her lawyer, who was loud in the lobby in the way that people are loud when they're covering for being nervous. I don't want to walk you through every hour of it. What I will tell you is that the hospital record from 2 years prior mattered. The GP chart notes mattered. A sworn statement from my father's longtime friend, the one Sandra had tried to recruit to her side, who had instead called me back a second time and said, "I'm going to tell you something," that mattered enormously. He described a phone call with my father, roughly 6 weeks before the new will was signed, in which my father had said he was confused about some paperwork Sandra wanted him to look at, and asked if this friend thought lawyers always did what was right for you. I did not cry in the courtroom. I'm mentioning that because it was the hardest single thing I have done in my adult life, and I want to be honest about that. In British Columbia, when a court finds that undue influence has been exercised over a testator, the will is struck. The estate reverts to the previous valid will if one exists. One did exist. One did exist. Signed 11 years ago. Sole beneficiary, me. The judge's decision came down 6 weeks later. I was at my desk when the email came in. I read it twice. Then I got up, walked to the window of my office that looks out over the parking structure, and stood there for a while. Sandra's lawyer filed a notice of appeal within the allowable period. That appeal was rejected without a hearing. The house in Abbotsford is mine. I am renting it to a retired couple from Burnaby because I cannot live there yet. I don't know if I ever will, but I walk through it once a month and I make sure it's taken care of, and sometimes I stand in the kitchen where my father packed his lunch every morning for 30 years, and it still smells faintly like coffee and sawdust, and I let myself stay there for a few minutes before I lock up and leave. The cabin is also mine. The realtor's listing was taken down. The yellow curtains are still on the kitchen window. The canoe is in the shed. The screened porch faces the same water it has always faced. I went back in May. I made coffee in the same pot my mother used. I sat on the porch in the early morning when the lake was flat and silver, and the loons were calling back and forth across the water, and I thought about what she said to me that last summer. You'll remember who you are. I blocked Sandra's number. I blocked her son. I have not explained myself to anyone who chose her version of events over mine, because some doors deserve to stay closed. I am not the person in this story who lost, and I did not need anyone's permission to know that. I think about the morning I got that text a lot. Not with anger anymore, more with a kind of clarity that only comes after the worst of something has already passed. Sanders sent 7 words and thought they were enough to close a door on me permanently. What she didn't understand is that the people who try to shut you out are usually the ones who already know, on some level, that you have every right to walk through. There's something I've come to believe about how life tends to sort itself out. Not in a mystical way, not in a way that requires any particular faith, but in the straightforward, almost mechanical way that choices compound over time. Sandra made a choice to bring my father to a lawyer's office, while he was still recovering from a neurological event. Her son made a choice to post a tribute online for a man he barely knew. The estate attorney made a choice to sign off on a document without asking the harder questions. None of those choices happened in a vacuum. They all pointed in the same direction, and eventually, when you lay enough of them end to end in front of a judge, they tell a story that can't be argued with. That's what I mean when I say integrity is the longest game. Not virtue for its own sake, not performing goodness so that someone will notice, but the quiet, consistent practice of doing things properly, even when no one is watching and it costs you something. I had kept records for 2 years before I ever needed them. I had stayed in my father's life even when the dinners were uncomfortable and the conversations felt managed. I had not said the sharp things I sometimes wanted to say, not because I was a pushover, but because I understood that someday what I hadn't done would matter as much as what I had. And then there's the other piece, the part that took me longer to learn. Grief makes you want to act from feeling. The morning I read that text, I wanted to call Sandra and say things I couldn't take back. The afternoon I found the real estate listing for the cabin, I wanted to drive to Kelowna and pound on her door. I didn't do any of that. I sat with the anger until it cooled into something I could actually use. I made a list. I called my lawyer. I pulled the hospital records. Every step I took was deliberate, because I'd seen enough in my career to know that emotional decisions leave gaps, and gaps are where cases fall apart. Hazel, my dad used to call me his careful one, which I think was his quiet way of saying he trusted me. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was sitting in a courthouse in January with 2 binders of documentation, watching the other side scramble. What the cabin taught me, what my mother tried to tell me on that porch all those years ago, is that knowing who you are is not a feeling. It's a practice. You build it the same way my father built his business, slowly, without much fanfare, by showing up and doing the work right even on the days when no one is paying attention. And when someone tries to take what's yours, that foundation is the only thing that actually holds. The loons are still on the lake in May. The yellow curtains are still on the window. I made coffee this morning in the same pot. Some things were always going to be mine.